My name is Dr. Laura McGuire, and I'm the CEO of the National Center for Equity and Agency Inc. My background as a social scientist has been in sexual misconduct prevention and response, and that's a wide field. So I've worked in Title IX, in the military, in what's called SAPR or SHARP, victim advocacy, prevention education in K-12, and with domestic violence victims, child abuse victims, in many different scenarios all across the country and the world.
How have your lived experiences informed your practice?
I think anytime someone comes to the table with expertise, there's kind of two branches of that. One, someone can have this academic background, which is really important because it infuses data and other people's narratives into the conversation. So it's not the danger of a single story. But then there's also when people have walked through something that they're advocating for change around. And as someone who's worked with students who are survivors, as a survivor myself, and as someone who been a doula, had to work with people in moments of extreme vulnerability, that really gives me this lens of wanting to hear and see people fully, to honor their stories, and to make sure they feel that they were heard, even if necessarily the results of them seeking justice don't turn out the way we hoped. At least there was a therapeutic experience throughout.
What is the National Center for Equity and Agency, and what education and consulting does it offer for lawyers?
So in 2018, I was working for the military doing victim advocacy and prevention education. I had worked in universities, as I mentioned, K-12, all different scenarios. And I loved what I was doing, but I was getting a lot of calls from people saying, can you come here and do that? Can you help us with curriculum, with a strategic plan? And I have to say, I'm sorry, I'm stuck in this one location. I can't really move. And so I took this tremendous leap. I was a single mother. I had no contracts lined up. But I had a place that I knew I could stay with family back in Florida. So we packed everything in our car, drove down, and I founded my consulting firm, the National Center for Equity Agency. And like I said, we didn't have a plan necessarily, but we knew there was a need. And how that continued to develop was I would do a lot of education on trauma-informed care, and attorneys were very drawn to that, particularly, again, because I have the mix of scholarship and the survivor experience. And they said, could you expand this even more? Because we go to law conferences and we get the 101 stuff, right? We know trauma's real. We know litigation could add to that trauma. But we'd really like it to be something that could be more forward-facing. So that's how we developed our trauma-informed certification. And that's a day and a half of in-depth education. And we look at everything from how do you advertise yourself as trauma-informed practitioners? What does that look like day to day? So we go into things like, what's a trauma-informed email? What's a trauma-informed text message to a client? And then we also want to focus on the secondary trauma that attorneys are experiencing, because that was one of the things that honestly surprised me, the gravity of that. I had a lawyer reach out to me early on when we were developing this, and they said on the back of their bar card was the number for Alcoholics Anonymous. They said, we deal with so much trauma, and often we do not have any education around how to deal with that in a way that's not maladaptive. And so that's another part of what we do is really focus on how do you process those feelings, validating that they're real, the cognitive neurological impact of that. And then we also have a second program, which is half a day, where people get to play around with research-informed self-care tools, and that's called our Regrow program. And together, it's been such a profound experience to see what people take away from that.
How do you define trauma-informed law?
So if we're going to define trauma-informed law, we have to first look at what is trauma-informed care, and then how is it applied in a legal context. So I'm a social scientist. I love history. I love to know where things were first founded. And so we can look back at the history of trauma-informed, at least hypotheses, back to the Civil War, when doctors were first writing about this new phenomenon where soldiers were coming back and they weren't the same and they weren't getting better from that. And sadly, our history as a country is that we traditionally institutionalized people. We blamed them. We said it was a moral weakness. And this carries on for, well over 100 years. When social scientists start really researching what is that experience, what's going on with somebody when they can't seem to bounce back from something terrible that's happened, whether it was one moment, like a car accident or a robbery, or something that was chronic and sustained, like surviving child abuse. They then realize, oh, this is not the person's fault at all. And it isn't until 2001 that all of that research really culminates and gives us a different term. And so trauma-informed care as a phrase is only 25 years old. It's pretty radical because it's that new. I actually have people in my training sometimes who say, oh, I was born in 2001. I say, you're just as old as trauma-informed care. That's so cool. And then when we think about it in the law context, in our trainings, we break it down into 5 tenets, which really are just focused on what does this look like in practical application? Because I can wax poetic all day about, what's going on with the brain, the history, more of the science, its application. But unless people really somatically feel, okay, this is what I want my clients to experience when they walk in my door. Here's how I want to prepare them for a deposition, or how I want them to experience mediation so that it's as not re-traumatizing as possible, knowing that those experiences inherently are. And that looks like things like making sure people feel that their story is being honored, that you're seeing them as an intersectional being, not just another case number, that you're going to advocate for them, that you're also going to honor their boundaries and your own. And that's key to this too, right? If attorneys, paralegals are running on fumes, if they are depleted, all the education in the world isn't going to help them when they show up and they just don't have anything else to give. So building in those boundaries for yourself and self-care is why it's so foundational to this practice and being able to sustain it. And all of that together gives us this perspective on trauma-informed law. And again, kind of thinking about trauma-informed care, it's number one, simply the understanding of the depth and breadth of trauma in the world around us. This is not a rare thing, sadly. It is not a niche issue. And then it's approaching every single person you meet as if they potentially are a survivor, and that includes your colleagues. I think a lot of people would be surprised by how many professionals, C-suite executives, to practicing attorneys, et cetera, have disclosed to me that they very recently have experienced interpersonal violence, right? This isn't necessarily even something from long ago. They can be experiencing it now in their private life. And so when we're interacting with each other, again, even colleague to colleague, peer to peer, we want to have the same perspective.
How can seeking justice be re-traumatizing, and why is it important to mitigate that?
So seeking justice, I think, as a cultural notion is something that obviously people feel passionate about and excited about, right? Of course, something terrible happened to me. I want justice to be served. But anyone who's worked in these spaces for any amount of time will know how incredibly challenging that is. The burden of proof is so often on the survivor, and many times the reality is the bar for evidence and prosecution is so incredibly high, it may not work out in the way that they hoped. And so it's important that we're incredibly honest with people. When they come to us and say, do I have a case? What do you think could come from this? If there is an understanding that it's probably going to be difficult, we need to explain that. Now, that doesn't mean we tell someone, give up, don't pursue this at all, but that we give them a clear picture. Because one of the things that's really important in trauma-informed law is understanding that context is comfort. People panic, right? Either they ask us a million questions and they won't stop calling, or they completely disappear and never follow up after they've been retained. And a lot of times that's because they don't understand what's going on. We as professionals have this full holistic purview on, well, this is that factor and I'm pursuing it this way because of these contingent areas. But the individual probably doesn't have a legal background, may have never worked in victim advocacy, and they don't know what's going on. So it's important that we give them that understanding, that we walk them through those what ifs. And when we do that, they become a much easier person to work with because they feel that sense of agency of, yes, I'm helping to navigate this and I'm making the best decision for me. And sometimes that's going to work out the way we ideally hope, and sometimes it's not. But either way, they felt that their story and their experience was honored as that holistic intersectional person they showed up in our office to be.
What are the key areas of trauma-informed care for legal practice?
So some key areas are really thinking about from that first contact, that very first cold phone call or email, all the way to a final judgment or an alternative resolution, that person understands, like I said, what is going on, first of all, that the attorneys are taking care of themselves throughout, and that they're thinking about all of the different ways that a re-traumatizing experience can show up. That can look like going to a mediation, and while there was already an understanding that we wanted to have the opposing parties in different rooms, it wasn't planned for when people would arrive. So they drive in and they see their abuser's car already there. Maybe they see them getting out. That can set the entire tone for that experience, and it's something that's so often overlooked. So coordinating that effectively, even things like when there's a break, who's going to use which bathroom? Are they going to cross each other in the hall? All of those things can either put someone in a neurological space where they are not able to reach an agreement, or they feel so supported that it's much more likely. And so when I'm working with attorneys, it's really helping them to understand that, including the language they use. There's different registers, we call it, of communication: casual, consultative, and formal. And as professionals, most of our documents that we're making people sign or we're explaining things to them are in consultative and very often formal, which means that an extremely high level of education is required to comprehend, right, legalese or anything adjacent to it. So you want to also be able to explain. Often firms will do this with some kind of form that breaks things down into easy bullet points and then a conversation. Some will do videos explaining different steps of the process that their clients can view to make sure it's in that casual, human-to-human style of communication and expression. That, again, helps the person understand what they're navigating and helps them to also show up to a mediation or deposition or trial in a much better state emotionally.
What aspects of deposition, mediation, and trial are especially re-traumatizing, and what can be done to mitigate this?
So we talked a little bit about mediation, right? And I think a lot of times people think, well, that's this positive space. But remember that for a lot of survivors, they have heard the cultural narrative that settling outside of court means that they lied or means that they're giving up. And so they might have real fears about what that looks like and agreeing to settle out of court. Media, movies, TV shows put that in this very negative light, right? And we even see stories where maybe a celebrity is accused of something, and then they say, all the survivors settled out of court, and they say, yep, I knew they were innocent, when that is not necessarily the case. We think about depositions, right? We know that's more emotionally charged. That is an environment where people are going to be questioned about the most sensitive and painful parts of their entire life story. And one of the things I also like to do is explain to attorneys that even when they know they're on the right side and they are trying to get this person who's probably done something absolutely horrendous to tell the truth or catch them in some sort of lie that they can bring to trial, that when people are on guard, when they're being aggressively questioned, they protect themselves, right? Maybe they throw out a lie even when they're telling the truth, or they know to prepare a different story and not relax and let out something that would be helpful to the case. And so we want to co-regulate, it's called, with the person and put them at ease, even if we know they're not telling us the truth or, again, they are hiding something that is really important to disclose. So there's a film that explains this so well called The Report, and it's based on a true story of a group of agents who are investigating a CIA tactic that was being rolled out in the early 2000s post 9/11. And they're investigating this because at the time, a group of psychologists had won this major contract with the federal government saying, we can guarantee that we can get all of this information from these terrorists on future attacks by breaking them down and creating a sense of what's called learned helplessness, aka torture. And to many people's not surprise, it didn't work at all, right? But to these agents who had hired them, they're like, oh my gosh, we're not getting any useful information. This is so strange. So these investigators find someone who worked there before this new program, who left. He was like, I'm not going to do this at all. And they said, we are finding that in the cases you worked on, you were able to identify this information and prevent future terrorist attacks. How did you do it? And he said there's only one thing that works: rapport building. And this is true in depositions too, right? If we go in and we're aggressive and we put someone on their guard, maybe the person is innocent and telling the truth, and now we've just re-traumatized them, or they start throwing information out to try to feel safe and they know, wait, that wasn't factual, but I was just scared. Or if they're hiding something, they're definitely not going to tell us the truth. People open up to those that they feel safe with. So even when you're opposing counsel, try to build rapport with them. It's trauma-informed, whatever's going on.
In addition to justice for survivors, how does trauma-informed care improve an attorney's practice?
So trauma-informed care is beneficial, as I've already touched on a little bit, right? Across the board, whether we're working with defendants or complainants, whatever their history is, it's going to benefit everybody. But I understand that sometimes people hear about this or they go to my trainings and they say, all right, Dr. McGuire, it's very cute. You're all touchy-feely. You're all, let's care and let's listen to people and see them. And that's not really my thing, right? That's nice, but I'm not necessarily passionate about that. I want to know how this is going to affect my bottom line. And I say, I hear you. That's totally fair. And guess what? It benefits that too. How much easier is this client going to be to communicate with if you communicate through a trauma-informed lens? Right? We kind of talked about the person who won't stop calling versus the person who disappears. Both of those are rooted in a neglect response. Perhaps throughout their life, they've tried to get help and they've been turned away or ignored or not believed. And now they have either an anxious attachment or an avoidant attachment. And it's making your job that much harder because you're not addressing it. It helps with your experience. And then think about, again, that bottom line. Attorneys always want to retain clients and get more referrals. They want people to leave a great review and tell anyone who's going through a similar situation about their firm. When someone has a trauma-informed, infused experience with a law firm, from the paralegal to the front desk person to the attorney representing them, they are your best word of mouth. They are going to stay with you. They are going to spread the word. Local advocacy agencies are going to do the same. And so whether you're someone who's like, yes, I'm here for all the feels, or you're someone who's like, okay, show me the money, it benefits you either way.
Aside from legal, you provide guidance on trauma-informed care in many industries. What is similar and what is different when it comes to law?
So I think what's interesting working with insurance, we train a lot of claims professionals, and that's similar to law in a lot of ways. But then my other past experiences working in education, with different nonprofits, those spaces, I'm coming in where there's a lot of people who are already bought in, right? I'm preaching to the choir. They might say, I'm learning so much, but the foundational core is already there. That's already been laid down. When I work with attorneys, so often they are really shocked because they are brilliant people. They're highly educated experts in their field. But maybe they've never gotten any kind of in-depth education on psychology and the sociology of the work that they're involved in. Last year, I gave a talk at a law school, and that was one of the big pieces of feedback that I got from the students, right? And these are students in school at this very moment, not 30 years ago. And they said, still to this day, we're really not getting any continuous lecture series, much less a class, which is what we'd really love, where we get to dig in deep into all of the things you got to touch on briefly in a 90-minute lecture. And so I think that's where some of the struggle is. People are so trained to be really aggressive. I say attorneys are often trained like cheerleaders, be aggressive. And when those tactics aren't giving them the results they necessarily want, or they're struggling to attract clients that they want to work with, or again, they kind of come in and out, they don't know what they're missing. And so often that social science perspective is that crucial piece. And so I think it's meeting people where they are, right? Just because they don't have that background doesn't mean that they can't certainly absorb this and start to implement it. And there are real world consequences to this. I've had defense attorneys tell me, wow, when we learned about something called polyvagal theory, we understood for the first time why during a class action settlement, certain survivors would not look us in the face. But we hadn't had this training ever in our lives, so we thought maybe they weren't telling us the truth or they weren't as traumatized, so we gave them less money. And I said, now that you've understood this, you know that those people probably have sustained the most trauma, or it's been so cumulative across their lifespan. It's a common response to want to look away, look disengaged, have a low affect, or look down at the ground, right? So again, separate from the theoretical, the direct application is so clear and so vital.
How can we create institutions that respect each person's dignity and well-being?
One of the things that I think so many people miss is how every micro interaction builds upon each other. If we're building institutions that care about trauma-informed practices, they have to think about that at every level. And when they don't, we notice things like institutional betrayal, which is its own form of trauma that people sustain. Right? When an institution turns against you, when they brush things aside, that has a lasting systemic impact. I remember years ago, I was working at a institution, a large higher ed institution, and we had a situation that was a very severe stalking and harassment case. The entire victim's family was being stalked and harassed by this person. It was horrible. And one of the people who was very high up shrugged their shoulders and said, it's just a young guy who's in love. They do crazy things. What are we going to do? Right? Now, they had already dealt with a lot of lawsuits based on not addressing these things and not looking at root causes. And here they were still in a position where people in power didn't think stuff was a big deal, right? So we have to look at it at that level. What are the conversations and meetings that are going on? Are we making fun of certain survivors or saying that we cast doubt on their story immediately? And then it's also, again, giving this to each other. We talk a lot in my trainings about you cannot give what you do not receive. You can't say, go out there and serve all of these people and care about them deeply and listen to them and understand what they're going through. Oh, but if you show up and you're having a hard time, you need to get it together. You're a professional. That doesn't work that way, right? Trauma-informed care has to be infused across all spheres. And so when institutions start to adopt that, start to use that language, start to also take that feedback. I want to hear about times I might have missed a crucial part of your story as my colleague. Then we see those paradigm shifts and sustain that shift.
When it comes to legal consulting, what kind of cases do you usually participate in, and what is your role?
So when I'm doing legal consulting, a lot of times it's helping them have a clearer picture on these missing aspects of the case that are often being overlooked. So as a social scientist and someone who has worked in so many different areas, I will often bring up, when we're talking to this institution, you want to be using this language. Let's look at the history of what's been going on here past this individual case. So, for example, just talking to attorneys about a particular institution that I knew the director of their legal department from other interactions we had had throughout my career. And I said, did you look at the fact that they've had this issue across many places that they've worked? Never thought to think of that, right? Or a lot of times I'm working with survivors and the institution has a religious foundation. So I'll say, what about their faith can we bring into this mediation or into this request or demand letter? And how can we make sure that the language we're using is supportive to their nervous system so that when they're reading that, they're not immediately saying, we're ready to fight, but instead we're ready to hear and collaborate for the benefit of all. Because I believe most people wake up each day and they have the best intentions. Maybe I'm a little overly optimistic, but I do believe that's true. And so then we have to work with their heart and mind and brain to facilitate that instead of discourage it.
What are the characteristics of an environment that ignores or promotes sexual misconduct?
That's a fascinating question. And people are always curious, right? Is our institution more likely to deal with this or less? Sometimes even when I'd be enrolled, I would meet parents at schools and they'd say, oh my gosh, your title sounds so scary, right? The sexual misconduct prevention person. Wow, is that a really big problem here? I'd say, not especially. It's a problem everywhere. It's a good thing that the school's invested in addressing this. But what are the things that cause that to happen? It's always a systems-based issue. And there's this thing called systems theory. And it tells us that we need to not look at what's called the identified patients, the people who clearly have a problem, right? We need to look at all of the other individuals, the policies, the procedures that have allowed this to get to this level. It's actually a lot like a story many of us heard in biology class. And it's been debunked, but it's a good story, which is we were told if you put a frog in a pot of room temperature water and you slowly turned up the heat and then it started to boil, the frog wouldn't even notice because it was turned up so slowly and then it's dead, right? That's what we see on the news. That's what we see when cases are filed, right? Is that, wow, things are boiling. Where did this come from? But the story goes, if you throw the frog in the hot water right away, it will jump out, right? If we can see something on the surface, we say, oh, that's easy to address. So often our institutions are dealing with that slow temperature rise. Again, comments, jokes, remarks. They're saying that people are saying, it's not that big of a deal. We'll brush it aside. I mean, it's not like they're doing something horrible. Right, but if you don't address it at that point, it will continue to escalate. Understanding that predatory people are always testing institutional environments. They're seeing, what can I get away with saying and doing? What are the little things that I can start to plant seeds for, allowing me to do even worse things in the future? And if they find out that the system is set up to address that right away, they'll know this is not the place where I can get away with this, and those behaviors will be extinguished.
After being involved with a number of these cases, are there any commonalities or broad takeaways you can share?
So one of the big takeaways is that there's no quick fix. People want that so badly, right? They're like, can you just come in and have this one quick talk, and then all of a sudden we will be transformed into trauma-informed people day in and day out, right? And I'm like, oh, it's not going to be that easy. We can start there, but it's going to be like a muscle. You're going to have to keep strengthening your trauma-informed mindset and holding each other accountable for it. Same thing with people saying, I've heard about trainings where there's a guarantee we can tell who's telling us the truth and who's lying. And yeah, if I sold that, I would probably be a millionaire right now because that's a very attractive offer, right? But we know that research doesn't support that. Human beings are incredibly complex. And the more that we accept that and embrace that, the better. And so what I want people to know is, start with investing in this information. Start looking at the way that your systems as a firm or in your community, your bar association, think about how they work. Are they coming from a trauma-informed platform? And then you have to agree to make sure that this becomes something you're invested in over months and years so that it becomes ingrained into the way that you function as a whole.
Now, can you talk a little bit about the importance of rebuttals?
So when we talk about rebuttals, it's really important to understand why getting different experts with different areas of expertise is absolutely game-changing because so many times one expert will be brought in and maybe they have a lot of experience in one area, but they don't quite know what they're talking about in another, and yet they're giving this expert opinion. An example from a case that I had years ago is we had someone who had a psychology background but was not trained in sexology. Like I am, I'm not a therapist, I'm not a psychologist, but I have a lot of expertise in this other lens. And what was interesting is they had made a comment about, well, I don't know if this case is true because we would need a medical examiner to look at the victim and see if they had signs of penetration. And I immediately pushed back because I know for a fact that that is not necessarily evidence one way or another. There's a large-scale study that was done in 2004 that concretely disproved this concept, this notion that many people still have. It's called the Kellogg study, and it's also called the normal study because they looked at 36 adolescent female victims who were pregnant from assault. So concrete evidence that this had absolutely happened. And of the 36, only 2 had physical signs of penetration. Many still had their hymen, to be graphic about it, right? And so if you have that as your only testimony on a case that is so crucial, so sensitive as a child being assaulted or a young adult being assaulted, and that is put forth and the judge says, I don't know any different, I'm not a sexologist, that sounds valid to me, you have to have the experts who can come in and address that misconception. So I hope that when people are looking at that information, they know it's one perspective. It's probably a small piece of a puzzle, and to work collaboratively with multiple experts who can come in and address that so that somebody's attempts to experience therapeutic jurisprudence is carried out to its fullness.
Do you have any final thoughts to share?
So when we think about respecting people's dignity and well-being, that is absolutely integral to any kind of trauma-informed perspective. And when I do education on this, I know that people, again, can see all the facts and figures, learn all the terms, and feel like, okay, that's a ton of front-loading. My brain's overwhelmed. But stories are what grab them and allow them to really feel that. So an example is the oak tree, right? A lot of people have used the analogy of an iceberg, but I feel like folks are tired of that and icebergs are cold and uninviting. So let's imagine people like trees. An oak tree is unique because the circumference of its branches are 1/3 the circumference of its root system. And people are the same way. So often we meet a client or, again, even a new employee, we put them into a template. We immediately see them and say, okay, I think they're about this old. I think these are their identities. I think probably this is their politics, all those things, right? We just fill them in our mind. And so often they are profoundly inaccurate. And so when we're thinking about how do we make sure that we are working with people, again, from that holistic lens, it's looking at those roots. It's getting curious about each other. I know I have this assumption in my mind, but tell me, who are you really? What are your hopes, your dreams, the things that cause a trigger response in you, right? I want to understand that so that I can most effectively support you. And the other example is another tree, which is the pando tree system. They're up in Utah. They're a forest of aspen trees, or so people thought for a long time, but it's not quite so. Because what looks like a forest of individual trees is actually branches of a tree that is underneath the ground. It's one solid tree that looks like thousands, tens of thousands of trees which are branches. And so often as people, we are this way. Right? We think my story is my story, your story is your story, and never the two shall meet. But the reality is that our stories are interwoven. And particularly when we're working with clients who come from communities who've experienced historical and communal trauma, they are bringing that into the conversation that we're having with them right now. And we have to honor and acknowledge that.